Let's establish some ground rules, he said, his voice cold and businesslike. This marriage is political. I needed a witch bride to satisfy the alliance, your coven needed protection. That's all this is. I don't expect affection, I don't want companionship, and I certainly don't need you trying to act like this is some fairy tale romance. Elara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I wasn't under any illusions, your majesty. Good. Then you understand that I have other arrangements. Seraphina and I have an understanding. She remains my companion and you? He gestured vaguely. You're the Luna in title only. Show up at official functions, don't cause political incidents, and otherwise stay out of my way. The great hall of the Silver Moon Pack stood bathed in candlelight that flickered against stone walls older than memory, casting dancing shadows across the assembled crowd of wolves and witches who had gathered for a union no one wanted but everyone needed. At the altar, draped in silver silk that did nothing to mask her trembling, stood Elara Ashwood, 22 years old, powerless, and acutely aware that she was the sacrificial lamb in a political game she'd never asked to play. Her honey-brown hair had been woven with moonflowers, her dress was exquisite enough to make queens weep with envy, and none of it mattered because the man waiting for her at the altar looked at her with the kind of indifference usually reserved for furniture. Alpha King Daemon Shadowcrest was everything the stories promised, tall and commanding with silver eyes that could freeze blood, dark hair that fell just past his collar, and a face carved from stone and moonlight. He was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and when Elara's shaking hand was placed in his during the ceremony, his grip was perfunctory at best, his attention clearly elsewhere. She followed his gaze and found it resting on a woman in the third row, voluptuous and confident with midnight black hair and crimson lips curved in a smile that promised things Elara barely understood. The Mistress. Everyone knew about her, whispered about her, and no one had bothered to spare Elara the humiliation of her presence at the wedding. Do you, Daemon Shadowcrest, Alpha King of the Eastern Territories, take this woman as your mate in Luna? The priest's voice echoed through the hall. I do, Daemon said flatly, the words carrying all the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to file paperwork. And do you, Elara Ashwood, Powerless Witch of the Ashwood Coven, take this man as your mate in Alpha? Powerless. They'd actually included it in the vows. Elara's throat closed with humiliation, but she forced the words out. I do. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and cold, his lips barely brushing hers before he pulled away like she'd burned him. The crowd erupted in forced celebration, wolves howling tradition, witches murmuring blessings they didn't mean, while Elara stood beside her new husband and wondered if it was possible to die from shame and still be forced to keep breathing. The feast afterward was lavish and interminable. Elara sat at the high table between her new husband and his beta, picking at food she couldn't taste while conversation swirled around her like water around a stone. Daemon spoke to everyone except her, discussing territory disputes with his counselors, laughing at jokes from his warriors, and several times leaning close to whisper something to a servant who would then disappear in the direction of the mistress's table. Each time, the woman would smile like she'd won a prize, and Elara would shrink further into herself. You're not eating, Luna, the beta, a kind-faced man named Marcus, observed quietly. The cook will be offended. I'm not hungry, Elara replied, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't carry. Is it true that, she paused, gathering courage. Is it true that she lives here? In the castle? Marcus's expression turned pitying. Lady Seraphina has her own chambers in the East Wing. She's been the king's companion for 3 years. And everyone just accepts this? She's powerful, influential, and he cares for her, Marcus said carefully. Your marriage was political necessity, Luna. No one expected feelings to be involved. Just my dignity, apparently, Elara muttered, but Marcus had already been called away by another counselor, leaving her alone in a room full of people celebrating a union that everyone knew was a farce. The evening dragged on with endless toasts and traditional dances that Elara was mercifully not expected to participate in, given that the Alpha King had made no move to dance with his new bride. She watched wolves pair off, watched witches conjure small illusions for entertainment, and felt the absence of her own magic like a missing limb. She'd been born wrong, broken, a witch with no power in a world where power was everything. Her coven had tolerated her out of pity and familial obligation, and when the Alpha King had demanded a witch bride to seal the alliance between their peoples, they'd offered her up without hesitation. The powerless daughter no one would miss. You look miserable, a voice said beside her, and Elara turned to find a young man in servant's clothes offering her a glass of wine. He couldn't have been more than 25, with warm brown eyes and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that softened his sharp features. I'm Kale. I work in the kitchens. Everyone's supposed to be celebrating, but you look like you'd rather be anywhere else. Is it that obvious? Elara accepted the wine gratefully, surprised by the kindness in his voice when everyone else had been treating her like an unfortunate piece of furniture. Only to someone who spent most parties hiding in corners himself, Kale admitted with a small smile. Being a servant means you see everything and are noticed by no one. Tonight, I saw a woman who's been married to a man who hasn't looked at her once. That seemed worth acknowledging. Tears pricked at Elara's eyes. The first genuine human interaction she'd had all evening was coming from a servant, which said everything about her new station. Thank you. That's kind. Kindness costs nothing, Kale replied, then glanced toward the high table where Daemon was deep in conversation with Seraphina, his hand resting possessively on her waist. Though around here it's in short supply. If you need anything, Luna, someone to talk to, help navigating the castle, an ally, find me. I'm usually in the gardens at dawn. Before Elara could respond, he'd melted back into the crowd of servants, leaving her with the first spark of hope she'd felt all day. Maybe not everyone in this cursed castle would treat her like trash. The evening finally, mercifully ended as midnight approached. Tradition demanded that the Alpha King escort his new Luna to the royal chambers to consummate the marriage bond, sealing their union in both law and flesh. Elara's stomach twisted with dread and anticipation in equal measure. She didn't want this cold stranger touching her, but at least it would be done, the obligation fulfilled, and maybe afterward he'd leave her alone. Daemon stood from the high table, and the hall fell silent in anticipation. Every eye turned toward the new couple, waiting for the traditional gesture. The Alpha King's expression was unreadable as he approached Elara, but she caught the way his gaze flicked toward Seraphina first, some silent communication passing between them. Come, Daemon said shortly, offering his hand with all the warmth of a business transaction. Elara took it, her fingers trembling in his grip as he led her from the hall. The crowd erupted in howls and cheers, traditional wedding night celebrations that made her face burn with embarrassment. They walked through corridors lit by torches, climbing stairs toward the royal wing, and with each step, Elara's heart hammered harder against her ribs. The royal chamber was magnificent, a massive bed draped in furs and silks, a fireplace crackling with warmth, windows overlooking moonlit forests. It should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like a beautiful cage. Daemon released her hand the moment the door closed behind them and immediately moved to pour himself a drink from the sideboard. He downed it in one swallow, poured another, and only then turned to look at her properly for the first time all evening. Let's establish some ground rules, he said, his voice cold and businesslike. This marriage is political. I needed a witch bride to satisfy the alliance, your coven needed protection. That's all this is. I don't expect affection, I don't want companionship, and I certainly don't need you trying to act like this is some fairy tale romance. Elara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I wasn't under any illusions, Your Majesty. Good. Then you understand that I have other arrangements. Seraphina and I have an understanding. She remains my companion and you? He gestured vaguely. You're the Luna in title only. Show up at official functions, don't cause political incidents, and otherwise stay out of my way. And the consummation? Elara forced herself to ask, hating how small her voice sounded. Tradition requires. Fuck tradition, Daemon interrupted harshly. I'm not touching you, Elara. The bond doesn't require consummation to be legal, just the vows. We're married in the eyes of law and pack. That's sufficient. The rejection shouldn't have hurt. She didn't want this man, didn't want any of this. But somehow it stung anyway, adding insult to an already devastating day. I see. Do you? Daemon moved closer and Elara instinctively took a step back. He noticed and his lip curled slightly. You're terrified of me? Good. That's healthy. I'm not a kind man, Elara. I'm Alpha because I'm strong enough to hold the position through violence and intimidation. Your coven sent me their weakest member like she was trash to be disposed of, and I accepted because refusing would have broken the alliance. But don't mistake political necessity for anything resembling desire. I don't want you. I will never want you. And the sooner you accept that, the easier your life here will be. Each word landed like a physical blow, and Elara felt something inside her crack. She'd known she was unwanted, had spent 22 years being the family disappointment, but hearing it stated so baldly, being told explicitly that she was so worthless even a political husband couldn't muster basic courtesy, it broke something fundamental. Understood, Your Majesty, she managed, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. May I be dismissed? Daemon waved a hand in dismissal, already turning back toward the door. Your chambers are through there? He pointed to a connecting door Elara hadn't noticed. You'll sleep separately. Don't wander the castle at night. Don't bother me unless it's an emergency. And for both our sakes, don't develop any foolish expectations about this arrangement improving. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the suddenly too large room. Elara stood frozen for several heartbeats, processing the complete destruction of every hope she'd harbored, foolish hopes apparently, that maybe this could be bearable. Then she heard it. Through the walls, from the next corridor over, the east wing where Seraphina's chambers were. Laughter low and sultry. A woman's voice raised in pleasure. The unmistakable sounds of passion that should have been Elara's wedding night. Her husband was having sex with his mistress within an hour of marrying her, close enough that she could hear every moan, every murmured endearment, every sound of pleasure he would never give her. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that Elara couldn't even cry. She simply stood in the middle of the beautiful chamber, listening to her husband claim another woman, and wondered if it was possible to die from shame. Eventually, she moved to the connecting door Daemon had indicated and found smaller but still luxurious chambers, clearly meant for a Luna who would occupy them alone. There was no connecting door to the Alpha's room from here, no pretense that this would be a shared space. She was being relegated to the servants' wing in all but location. Elara locked the door, stripped off the wedding dress that had cost more than her family's yearly income, and climbed into bed still wearing her underthings because she couldn't bear to be fully naked when she felt this exposed. The sounds from Seraphina's chambers had finally quieted, leaving only silence and the knowledge that this was her life now, married but unwanted, Luna but powerless, alone in a castle full of people who viewed her as nothing more than a political obligation. She finally let herself cry then, great heaving sobs that she muffled in the pillow so no one would hear her breaking. This was her wedding night, the night every girl was supposed to dream about, and she was spending it alone, discarded, listening to her husband pleasure another woman. Tomorrow would be worse. She knew that with certainty. Tomorrow she'd have to face the castle's residents, endure their pity or contempt, navigate a world where she had no power and no allies. Tomorrow she'd have to be Luna to people who would never respect her, wife to a man who'd made his disdain clear. But tonight, alone in the darkness, Elara let herself grieve for every hope she'd harbored and every dream that had just died. Tomorrow she'd find a way to survive this nightmare. Tonight she just needed to cry. The days following Elara's wedding blurred into a nightmare of casual cruelty that wore her down with systematic precision. Daemon ignored her completely except during official functions where protocol demanded her presence, and even then he positioned Seraphina close enough that everyone understood the true hierarchy. The mistress had taken to calling Elara, the ghost Luna, a nickname that spread through the castle with malicious speed because it was cruelly accurate. Elara haunted the corridors like something already dead, present in body but utterly invisible to the man who'd vowed to be her partner. Seraphina's cruelty was more active and creative. She would accidentally spill wine on Elara's dresses at dinner, laugh with the other high-ranking wolves about the broken witch, who couldn't even conjure a simple light spell, and had somehow convinced the household staff that Elara's quarters didn't require the same level of service as other nobles. Elara would return to her chambers to find fires unlit despite the autumn chill, meals delivered cold or not at all, and no one responded when she rang for assistance because everyone understood that displeasing Seraphina carried consequences while displeasing Elara carried none. The worst part wasn't the active malice, it was the complete indifference from Daemon. When Seraphina humiliated Elara publicly, he would watch with the mild interest of someone observing weather, neither intervening nor caring. When Elara finally gathered the courage to approach him about basic necessities in her quarters, he'd waved her off with, "Handle it yourself. You're Luna. Figure out how to command respect instead of complaining to me." How was she supposed to command respect when he'd made it clear she had none? When his own behavior signaled that she was worthless. The only bright spot in those early weeks was Kale. True to his word, he'd been in the gardens at dawn the morning after the wedding, and Elara had found him tending herbs with capable hands. He'd looked up at her approach and simply said, "Rough night?" with such gentle understanding that she'd nearly cried again. They'd talked for an hour that first morning, about nothing important, just conversation to remind Elara that someone in this cursed castle saw her as human. It became a routine. Every morning before the castle truly woke, Elara would slip into the gardens and find Kale already there. He'd share stories about the other servants, teach her the castle's secret passages, and gradually, carefully help her rebuild the confidence that Daemon and Seraphina were systematically destroying. "You're stronger than you think," Kale told her one morning about 3 weeks into her marriage. They were sitting on a bench overlooking the herb garden, and his voice was serious. "They're trying to break you, Elara. Don't let them." "I have no power," she replied, the familiar refrain that had defined her entire life. "No magic, no position, no respect. What strength do I have? The strength to keep getting up every morning despite everything they do to you. The strength to still be kind even though kindness hasn't been shown to you. The strength to survive." He hesitated, then added quietly, "That's the kind of strength that outlasts magic and power, Elara. That's the kind that changes worlds." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was something valuable in her beyond power she didn't possess. But weeks of systematic degradation had worn her down until she could barely remember what confidence felt like. The breaking point came on a cold October afternoon when Elara encountered Daemon and Seraphina in a rarely used corridor on the eastern wing. She'd been trying to find the library, one of the few places she was allowed without question, and had gotten turned around in the castle's maze of passages. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with them, Seraphina draped against Daemon's side with proprietary satisfaction while he murmured something in her ear that made her laugh. They noticed Elara at the same moment, and Seraphina's expression shifted to predatory delight. "Oh look darling, it's your wife. How lovely to run into you, Luna. We were just discussing the upcoming moon festival. You'll be attending, I assume?" "If it's required," Elara said carefully, trying to step around them in the narrow corridor. Seraphina shifted to block her path, her smile sharp as broken glass. "You know, I've been wondering something. How does it feel to be married to a man who's made it clear he'll never touch you? To know that he comes to my bed every single night instead of yours? Does it hurt being so thoroughly rejected?" "Seraphina," Daemon said, but his tone was more amused than warning. "I'm just curious," the mistress continued, moving closer to Elara with predatory grace. "You must lie awake at night listening to us, don't you? Hearing everything you'll never have, everything you're too worthless to deserve. Do you touch yourself while listening, little broken witch? Pretend it's you he's fucking instead of me?" Elara's face flamed with humiliation, but she forced herself to meet Seraphina's eyes. "Excuse me. I need to get past." Ah, she's embarrassed. How adorable. Seraphina reached out and grabbed Elara's chin, her grip bruising. "Let me give you some advice, Luna. You will never be enough for him. You have no power, no beauty that compares to mine, no skills in bed to compete with what I give him. You're a political obligation he tolerates, nothing more. The sooner you accept that and stop harboring pathetic hopes, the easier this will be." "Let go of me," Elara said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Make me," Seraphina challenged. "Oh wait, you can't. Because you're powerless. Because you're worthless. Because even your own coven was happy to be rid of you." Daemon was watching this exchange with the detached interest of someone observing theater, making no move to intervene despite his wife being actively harassed. That indifference hurt worse than Seraphina's words. "I said let go," Elara repeated, trying to pull away. Seraphina's hand tightened, nails digging into skin. "Or what? You'll run crying to your husband? He doesn't care, little witch. He'll never care. You're—" The slap came from nowhere, Elara's hand moving of its own accord to crack across Seraphina's face with enough force to leave a red handprint. The corridor went silent except for Seraphina's gasp of outrage. "You dare," the mistress started, but Elara was already moving, trying to get past before this escalated further. She made it 3 steps before Daemon's hand closed around her upper arm like an iron manacle, spinning her around with enough force to make her stumble. His silver eyes blazed with a fury she'd never seen directed at her before. "You just struck Seraphina," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "In my castle. Under my protection. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" "She was assaulting me," Elara protested, fear and anger warring in her chest. You were standing right there." "I saw my Luna behaving like a common brawler," Daemon interrupted coldly. "Seraphina was merely speaking truth, and you responded with violence because you can't handle hearing it. That ends now." He started dragging her down the corridor, his grip bruising, and Elara realized with growing horror where they were heading, toward the royal wing, toward the chamber she'd never been invited to enter. Panic flooded through her. "Let go, you're hurting me." "I'm about to hurt you significantly more," Daemon replied grimly. "You want to act like you have rights here? Like you deserve respect? Then you're going to fulfill at least one duty of a Luna. Maybe it'll remind you of your place." They reached the royal chambers and he kicked the door open, throwing her inside with enough force that she sprawled across the bed. Elara scrambled backward, genuine fear replacing anger as she saw the intent in his eyes. "Don't," she begged, hating the pleading in her voice but unable to stop it. "Please, not like this." "You don't get to tell me no," Daemon said, already removing his shirt with controlled violence. "You're my wife, my Luna. And one way or another, you're going to remember who owns you." What followed was brutal and brief, a claiming that had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with punishment. Daemon took her virginity with a violence that left her bleeding and sobbing, pinned beneath him while he used her body with mechanical efficiency. When it was done, he pulled away with disgust clear on his face. "You were a virgin," he said like it was an accusation. "Why didn't you say something?" Elara curled into herself, pain radiating through her core and tears streaming down her face. Would it have mattered? Daemon stared at her for a long moment, something like regret flickering across his features before hardening back into cold indifference. "Clean yourself up. And Elara? If you ever strike Seraphina again, what I just did will seem gentle in comparison." He left her there, bleeding, broken, and utterly alone. Elara lay in the wreckage of whatever innocence she'd still possessed and understood with perfect clarity that she couldn't survive this. Not long term. Either Daemon and Seraphina would completely destroy her, or she'd have to find a way to escape before there was nothing left to save. She eventually dragged herself to the bathroom and cleaned away the blood and evidence of violence, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. When she finally made it back to her own chambers hours later, moving gingerly because everything hurt, she found Kale waiting in the corridor outside her door. One look at her face and he went pale. "What happened?" "I can't," Elara's voice broke. "I can't talk about it. Please, I need to be alone." But Kale didn't leave. He followed her inside despite her protests, insisted on checking her for serious injuries with hands that were gentle and professional, and only when he was satisfied that she wasn't in immediate medical danger did he step back. "He did this," Kale said, and it wasn't a question. "The Alpha King." Elara couldn't answer, couldn't put into words what had just been done to her. She just curled up on her bed and wished she could disappear entirely. Kale sat on the floor beside the bed, close enough that she could hear him breathing but not touching. "I'm going to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone in this castle. And then you're going to decide what you want to do with that information." Through her pain and exhaustion, Elara felt curiosity stir. "What?" "My name isn't really Kale. It's Kieran. Kieran Nightshade." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that commanded attention despite the gentle tone. "I'm the heir to the LYCAN throne. The true LYCAN King, taken captive when I was 12 years old after my parents were murdered in a coup. I've been kept as a slave here for 15 years, hidden in plain sight because Daemon's father wanted insurance against LYCAN retaliation." Elara sat up despite the pain, staring at him with shock that momentarily eclipsed everything else. "That's impossible. The LYCAN heir was killed, everyone knows." "Everyone knows what they were told," Kieran corrected gently. "My uncle staged the coup, killed my parents, and would have killed me except Daemon's father saw an opportunity. A captive LYCAN prince, even a child, was worth more alive than dead. So I've been here ever since, serving the family that's held me prisoner." "Why are you telling me this?" Elara whispered. "Because you need to know that you're not alone. That there's someone in this castle who understands what it feels like to be powerless and trapped." He moved closer, his voice intense. "And because I'm going to escape, Elara. I've been planning it for years and I'm finally ready. When I do, I'm going to reclaim my throne and return with an army to challenge the Wolf King." "That's suicide," Elara protested. "Even if you are who you say you are, you can't take on an entire kingdom." "I can and I will," Kieran interrupted firmly. "But before I go, I wanted to give you a choice. You can come with me. Leave this castle, this marriage, these people who are destroying you piece by piece. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you'd be free." The offer was tempting beyond words, but Elara shook her head. "My coven is bound to this alliance. If I run, they'll suffer the consequences. Daemon will punish them for my escape. Then I'll take you somewhere safe and come back for you," Kieran said. "When I have my throne, when I have power to negotiate from a position of strength. I'll return for you, Elara. That's a promise." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that escape was possible, but exhaustion and pain were pulling her under. "When are you leaving?" 3 days. There's a new moon, darker, easier to move unseen. I know a passage that leads beyond the castle walls." He hesitated, then added quietly, "If you change your mind, if you want to come with me, I'll be in the East Garden at midnight. Wait for me there." "I can't," Elara said, but the words lacked conviction. "Then I'll go alone." "But Elara?" He waited until she met his eyes. "You deserve better than this. Better than a man who treats you like property, better than a life spent being broken down piece by piece. Remember that even if you don't believe it yet." He left before she could respond, slipping out of her chambers with the stealth born of years as a servant. Elara lay back down, processing the impossible information he'd shared and the choice he'd offered her. 3 days. In 3 days her only friend in this cursed castle would be gone, and she'd be truly alone with the wolves who were tearing her apart. She had 3 days to decide if she was brave enough to help him escape, and maybe, just maybe, if she was strong enough to believe that freedom was worth fighting for. 5 years. 5 years since Elara had stood in the East Garden at midnight and watched Kieran Nightshade, the LYCAN Heir, slip into the darkness through a passage she'd helped him open. 5 years since she'd pressed a bag of supplies and a map into his hands and whispered, "Come back for me when you're king." 5 years since he'd kissed her forehead and promised, "I will. Wait for me." 5 years was a long time to wait, and Elara had changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the broken girl who'd helped him escape. The morning after Kieran left, when Daemon discovered his prized prisoner missing and interrogated the entire castle in a rage, Elara had stood silent and expressionless while he'd screamed threats. She'd endured his fury with the same detachment she'd developed for all his cruelties, because something fundamental had shifted the night she'd chosen to help someone else even when she couldn't help herself. She'd found power not in magic. Her lack of abilities remained as absolute as ever, but in refusal. She refused to break. Refused to cry where they could see. Refused to give Daemon and Seraphina the satisfaction of watching her spirit completely die. It had started small, meeting Seraphina's insults with cold silence instead of tears, attending functions with her head high instead of hunched in shame, learning the castle's politics well enough to navigate them without anyone's help. But true change had come from an unexpected source, the other powerless witches. Elara discovered she wasn't alone. There were others in the surrounding territories, born without magic and cast aside by their covens. She'd started gathering them quietly, teaching them what Kieran had taught her, that power came in many forms and magic wasn't the only kind that mattered. They'd formed their own coven of sorts, supporting each other, pooling resources, learning mundane skills that made them valuable in non-magical ways. Daemon had noticed eventually, of course. He noticed everything that happened in his territory. But by then Elara's group had become useful enough, organizing supplies, managing logistics, connecting different communities, that even he had to acknowledge their value. He still treated Elara with indifference bordering on contempt, still kept Seraphina as his mistress in open defiance of their marriage, still made it clear his Luna was tolerated rather than valued. But Elara didn't need his validation anymore. She'd found her own. She was in the castle's lower library, a space she'd claimed for her group's meetings, when the first sounds of battle reached her. Howls of alarm, the clash of weapons, screams of the wounded. Elara's blood froze because those weren't the sounds of a minor skirmish or training exercise. Those were the sounds of war. She ran toward the main hall, her heart hammering, and found chaos. The castle was under siege, professional soldiers in colors she didn't recognize pouring through breached gates, engaging with Daemon's guards in brutal combat. The attackers fought with inhuman strength and coordination that marked them as not quite wolves, and Elara's mind made the connection with crystalline clarity. Lycans. These were Lycans. Which met. She searched the chaos frantically and found him at the center of the courtyard, fighting his way toward the keep with a sword that sang through the air like death incarnate. He was older than when he'd left, broader across the shoulders and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd reclaimed his birthright. Kieran Nightshade had kept his promise. He'd returned as the LYCAN King, and he'd brought an army to challenge the man who'd kept him prisoner. Daemon emerged from the keep in his wolf form, a massive silver beast that radiated alpha dominance, and even in chaos, Elara's breath caught at the majesty of it. He was terrible and beautiful, power incarnate, and when he locked eyes with Kieran, the hatred between them was palpable even from a distance. Nightshade. Daemon's voice carried above the din, "You dare invade my territory?" "I dare reclaim what was stolen from me," Kieran replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned rather than inherited. "You kept me as a slave for 15 years. Today I take back everything you took from me." They collided with a force that shook the ground, two alpha predators fighting for dominance while their respective forces continued the larger battle around them. Elara tried to move closer, desperate to see the outcome, but someone grabbed her arm and dragged her back into the castle. Luna, you need to get to safety, Marcus, Demon's Beta, still loyal after all these years, said urgently. The castle is being overrun. We need to get you to the secure chambers. No, Elara said, wrenching her arm free. I'm not hiding. Those people out there, some of them are mine. My coven. If there's fighting, they're vulnerable. She ran before Marcus could stop her, heading not toward safety but toward the lower levels where her group usually gathered. She found them huddled together, terrified but unharmed, and was organizing their evacuation to truly secure rooms when Seraphina appeared. The mistress looked wild-eyed and furious, her usually perfect appearance disheveled. You, she hissed, stalking toward Elara. This is your doing. You helped that slave escape 5 years ago, didn't you? You're the reason he's here, the reason we're under attack. I don't know what you're talking about, Elara replied calmly, though her heart raced. She'd never admitted to helping Kieran, and no one had ever proven her involvement. Liar. Seraphina's hand shot out, catching Elara across the face hard enough to split her lip. Demon should have killed you years ago instead of keeping you around out of political obligation. You're worthless, powerless trash who. The scream that tore from Elara's throat wasn't conscious. It was pure instinct, rage and pain, and 5 years of suppressed fury erupting in a sound that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. The world went white, then red, then blazing silver as something inside her that had been dormant for 27 years suddenly violently awakened. Her hair turned white from root to tip in an instant, every strand bleaching to the color of bone. Her eyes, she couldn't see them but she felt them change, felt power flood through her like lightning through water. And when she screamed again, the sound wasn't human anymore. It was the cry of a banshee. The supernatural shockwave exploded outward from her in concentric rings of visible sound, shattering windows and cracking stone walls. Everyone within range, Seraphina, Marcus, the LYCAN soldiers who'd breached the lower levels, dropped like puppets with cut strings, unconscious or dead, Elara couldn't tell which. The power kept pouring out of her, unstoppable and terrifying, until she forced her mouth closed and the sound cut off with shocking suddenness. In the sudden silence, Elara stared at her hands, pale and shaking, crackling with residual energy, and understood with perfect clarity what she'd become. Not powerless. Never powerless. Just dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to wake abilities so strong they'd been hidden even from herself. She was a banshee. The herald of death, the most powerful supernatural harbinger in existence. The sounds of battle from above had ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet. Elara climbed toward the courtyard, stepping over unconscious bodies and debris, and emerged into devastation. Her scream had reached the main battle. Fighters from both sides were down, some groaning as they regained consciousness, others ominously still. In the center of the courtyard, Demon and Kieran had both survived her outburst, though they stood frozen in shock. Demon had shifted back to human form, naked and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Kieran was in slightly better shape, though his sword hung loose in his grip as he stared at Elara with undisguised awe. You're a banshee, Demon said, and for the first time in 5 years, there was something other than contempt in his voice. There was fear. And desire. And the sudden, desperate understanding of what he'd thrown away. All this time you weren't powerless. You were dormant. Yes, Elara said, her voice steady and strange to her own ears, layered with harmonics that weren't quite human. I was dormant. And you spent 5 years treating me like trash because I didn't have power you could use. Demon took a step toward her, his hand extended. Elara, I was wrong. God, I was so wrong. We can fix this, start over, you're my mate, my Luna, we can. No, she said simply. The word hung between them like a blade. What? I reject you, Demon Shadowcrest, Elara continued, feeling the mate bond that had never been consummated, never been real, begin to fray with her words. I reject you as my mate, my alpha, my husband. You had 5 years to see me as something other than worthless. You chose cruelty instead. So no, we're not starting over. We're ending this. She felt the bond snap with an almost physical sensation, and Demon actually staggered as it severed. In the crowd of gathering witnesses, she saw Seraphina, alive but unconscious during Elara's outburst, begin to stir, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Kieran approached slowly, his sword sheathed, his hands visible and non-threatening. Elara, he said gently. I kept my promise. I came back for you. I know, she replied, looking at the man who'd been kind when no one else was, who'd taught her that survival was its own form of strength. But Kieran, I can't go with you. Pain flickered across his face. Why not? Because I need to figure out who I am now, Elara said, gesturing at herself, the white hair, the power still crackling under her skin, the destiny she'd just discovered. I spent 27 years thinking I was powerless, 5 more years rebuilding myself around that identity. Now I'm something else entirely, and I need to understand what that means before I can belong to anyone, even someone I care about. Then I'll wait, Kieran said immediately. However long it takes. I'll court you properly, Elara. No obligations, no claims, just... No, she interrupted gently. Don't wait for me, Kieran. You have a kingdom to rebuild, a throne to secure. Live your life. And maybe when I've figured out mine, our paths will cross again. She walked away from both men, the one who'd rejected her and the one who wanted to claim her, and felt stronger than she'd ever been in her life. Behind her, she heard Kieran giving orders to his soldiers, heard Daemon shouting something about negotiations, but it all faded as she moved through the castle toward her chambers. 5 years ago, she'd been the broken Luna, powerless and unwanted. Today, she was a banshee who just changed the course of a war with a single scream. Tomorrow she'd figure out what that meant. But tonight, she was simply Elara Ashwood, no longer Shadowcrest, that name discarded with the man who'd given it, and she was finally truly free. 5 years later. The village of Thornhollow sat in a valley far from packed territories and LYCAN kingdoms, a peaceful place where outcasts and misfits had built their own community away from supernatural politics. Elara had found it 2 years after the war, after spending time learning to control her banshee abilities and discovering that power without purpose was just as empty as powerlessness had been. She'd opened a school, a small building where young witches born without active magic could learn that their worth wasn't determined by power they didn't possess. She taught them history and herbalism, strategy and self-defense, all the practical skills that would make them valuable regardless of magical ability. Some stayed in Thornhollow, others moved on to lives in the wider world, but all of them left stronger than they'd arrived. It was a good life. Quiet, meaningful, hers. Elara had learned to braid her white hair in intricate patterns, had grown comfortable with the silver sheen her eyes now carried, had even begun to enjoy the respect that came from being known as the banshee teacher rather than the powerless Luna. She was in her garden planting herbs for the autumn harvest when she sensed him approaching, that particular energy signature she'd learned years ago, impossible to mistake for anyone else. "Hello, Kieran," she said without turning around. "You knew I was coming," he replied, sounding unsurprised as he entered the garden. Should have expected that from a banshee. Elara finally looked up and caught her breath. The years had been kind to him. He was older, more confident, carrying his authority with the ease of someone who'd grown into it. He wore simple traveling clothes instead of royal regalia, and his smile was warm and genuine. "You look well," she observed, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "The LYCAN throne suits you." "It keeps me busy," Kieran admitted, moving closer. "But not too busy to check in on an old friend. May I sit?" They settled on a bench overlooking her garden, and for a moment, simply existed in comfortable silence. Then Kieran said, "I have news. About your former husband." "I haven't thought about Daemon in years," Elara replied honestly. "Whatever happened to him doesn't concern me anymore." "Perhaps not, but you should know, he's dead. Seraphina poisoned him about 6 months after you left. She tried to take control of the pack, claiming authority as his longtime companion. It didn't go well." Elara felt nothing. No satisfaction, no grief, just distant acknowledgement of information. "What happened to her?" "I happened to her," Kieran said grimly. "The pack descended into chaos under her leadership, and it was destabilizing the entire region. I had to intervene, challenge her authority and—" he paused. "Remove her permanently. The pack is under LYCAN protection now, being rebuilt with new leadership." "So you're telling me that everyone involved in my misery is gone, and I can finally close that chapter completely," Elara summarized. "Yes. But I'm also here to ask you something else." Kieran turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Elara, I kept my promise. I waited. I built my kingdom, secured my throne, lived my life like you asked. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping that maybe, when you were ready, we could try this properly. So I'm asking, would you consider coming back with me? Not as an obligation, not as anything you don't choose freely, but as my Luna, my partner, my mate? I'm asking you to choose me, Elara. If you want to." The proposal was everything the first one hadn't been: respectful, patient, offering choice instead of demanding obligation. Elara looked at the man who'd been kind when she was broken, who'd taught her survival, who'd kept his promise to return when he was strong enough to offer her real protection. Yes, she said and watched joy transform his face. Yes, I'll come with you. I'll be your Luna. But Kieran, my school, my students, the life I've built here. Comes with you, he interrupted gently. We'll establish a larger school in the capital, fund it properly, give you resources to help even more powerless witches. Your work is important, Elara. I'd never ask you to abandon it. It was exactly the right answer. Proof that he saw her as a complete person rather than just a potential Luna. Elara stood and extended her hand, feeling the rightness of this choice settle into her bones. Then yes, I choose you, Kieran Nightshade. I choose this life, this partnership, this future we're going to build together. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that promised safety without suffocation, protection without possession. When he kissed her, it was sweet and careful, asking rather than demanding, and Elara felt something inside her that had been frozen for years finally, completely thaw. I love you, Kieran murmured against her lips. I've loved you since I was a servant and you were the only person who saw me as human. I'll love you until my last breath. I love you too, Elara replied, surprised by how easy the words came. It took me a while to get here, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. 2 weeks later, Elara rode away from Thorn Hollow on a white horse, her belongings packed and her school left in the capable hands of her senior students who'd promised to maintain it until she could establish its sister location. Beside her, Kieran rode with the easy confidence of a king returning home, and ahead of them the LYCAN capital waited. A new beginning, a real marriage, a future built on choice and love rather than obligation and cruelty. She'd been given as payment for alliance and had become a queen by choice. She'd been called powerless and awakened as one of the most powerful beings in existence. She'd been broken and rebuilt herself stronger. And now, finally, Elara Ashwood was going home, not to captivity but to freedom. Not to a man who owned her but to a partner who chose her. Not to powerlessness, but to the strength she'd always possessed and had simply needed to discover. Was a good ending. And an even better beginning. Craving more supernatural romance? If Elara and Kieran's journey from powerless prisoner to powerful queen had you captivated, subscribe now for more. Hit subscribe for weekly supernatural romance. Like if the Banshee Awakening gave you chills. Comment. Favorite moment? Team Kieran from the start, or were you conflicted? Notifications on so you never miss our next epic love story. Share with fantasy romance lovers who need this in their lives. Coming soon, Vampire Prince X Witch Hunter Forbidden Romance Dragon Shifter X Human Fated Mates Fae King X Mortal Woman Political Marriage Gone Right. More Alpha/Luna dynamics with healthy relationships. Subscribe now, your next obsession awaits.